In the year of 2048, one warrior stood alone against a world ruled by fear. He didn't have superpowers, he wasn't a robot, but what he was something more dangerous. He had skill, a blade, and the courage to face the impossible. Before ninjas were actually cool again, before cyberpunk took over the internet, there was Strider. But not the Strider most people know. We're about to uncover a version of Strider that almost no one talks about anymore. A game that had big dreams, but ended in confusion, cut corners, and in some people's eyes, not all, actual disappointment. This is the story of Strider for the NES. In the fast-moving world of video games during the late 1980s, Capcom was already a big name. Gamers everywhere knew them for hits like Mega Man, Ghosts and Goblins, and Commando. Their games generally were fast, fun, and super challenging. But in 1988, Capcom decided to do something extremely bold, something no video game company had really done before. Instead of just making another action game, Capcom teamed up with a Japanese manga studio called Moko Kikaku, and together they came up with a plan that was way ahead of its time. Now here's the pitch. What if they created a hero who would appear in more than just a single game? What if that character had his story told through a comic book or manga, an arcade game, and a whole game console? And get this, all at the same time. The idea was that each version would show a different part of the story, like puzzle pieces that came together to form one big picture. And that's how Strider Hiryu was born. And throughout this video, I will be saying Hiryu a lot. Why? Because it's just fun to say. So Strider Hiryu just wasn't another muscle-bound hero. He was different. He was a cyber ninja trained by a top-secret group of fighters known as the Striders. Now these warriors worked behind the scenes, stopping threats no one else even knew about. And Hiryu was the best of them, silent, swift, and deadly. And in traditional fashion, he didn't fight for fame. He fought to protect the world from evil forces hiding in the shadows. The main villain of the story was a powerful, mysterious dictator named the Grand Master. He ruled over a dark future filled with dangerous technology, creepy robots, and brainwashed followers. And of course, Strider Hiryu wasn't having none of that crap. But the story wasn't just about good guys and bad guys. It also explored deep themes like betrayal, loyalty, and sacrifice. Hiryu would have to make hard choices, sometimes risking everything for the mission. Now, the first part of the Strider story came out as a manga in Japan. It gave fans a closer look at Hiryu's background, his training, his missions, and what pushed him to become a Strider in the first place. The art was stylish and full of energy, just like the character himself. But that was only the beginning. In 1989, Capcom released the arcade version of Strider, and it was definitely a game changer. Players were actually blown away by its graphics, which showcased massive detailed levels and towering mechanical bosses. In this version of the game, Hiryu could flip, climb, and slash with his glowing weapon called the Cypher. And honestly, it felt like playing a sci-fi action movie. From the snow-covered cliffs of Kazakhstan to flying battleships and gravity-defying labs. The game never slowed down either. And for that reason, the arcade version became a hit in Japan and around the world. But what many players didn't know was there was something very different being made at the same time. Far away in the flashing lights of the arcade cabinets, another version of Strider was being quietly built, and that version was for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This version wouldn't be a simple copy of the arcade game. Instead, it would be a brand new chapter in Hiryu's story, with its own world, its own gameplay, and new secrets to uncover. Now, Capcom had never tried anything like this before. 3 connected projects, all launched around the world at the same time, all telling one epic story from different angles. And I'll say this, it was very creative. And it showed just how much the video game world was starting to grow, not just in gameplay, but in storytelling too. And so, the experiment begun. The legend of Strider Hiryu was just getting started. So in 1990, Capcom took a bold step. They released Strider for the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. But this just wasn't a simple copy of the popular arcade game. Instead, Capcom did something very unusual. They created a completely original version of Strider just for the NES. And while it had fast action and flashy moves, Capcom wanted to tell a deeper story, one filled with mystery, emotion, and adventure. Now what made the NES version stand out was how different it felt compared to the other games at the time. Most NES games were pretty straightforward. You ran, you jumped, and you fought enemies from one end of the level to the other. But Strider for the NES changed that formula. Capcom was inspired by games like Metroid, where you didn't have to just follow a straight path. You explored huge areas, found secret upgrades, and had to backtrack to places you'd already visited to unlock new paths. In this new version of Strider, players didn't just stay in one place. The game took them all over the world. You traveled to mysterious far-off places like Kazakh, Egypt, Australia, China, and even LA. Each location had its own puzzles to solve as well, enemies to fight, and secrets to uncover. You could briefly talk to the NPCs, which is non-playable characters, who gave you clues or helped move the story forward. So it wasn't just about fighting anymore, it was about figuring things out and understanding what was really going on. The player stepped into the shoes of Hiryu, a young but elite ninja agent from a secret organization called the Striders. At the start of the game, Hiryu was given a terrible order to track down and kill his old friend Kane, who was once a fellow Strider, but something just doesn't feel right. Instead of following his orders, Hiryu chooses to disobey. He throws away his title and goes rogue. Why? Because he believes there's more to the story, that there's a darker plan behind the mission. So Hiryu begins to investigate, searching for the truth and trying to rescue Kane from a hidden enemy pulling the strings behind the scenes. And what follows is a deep and emotional journey, especially for the NES at that time. The NES version of Strider wasn't just about swinging a sword or beating bad guys, it dealt with serious topics like betrayal, friendship, loyalty, and even mind control. Now for the time, that was pretty ambitious. Most NES games didn't dare try something this complex, and the hardware on the NES was kinda old and starting to show its age by the 1990 standards. And telling a big dramatic story with deep characters was kinda challenging. The graphics were limited and the memory was small, and the controls could only do so much with 2 buttons. But Capcom pushed the NES as far as it could go to try to bring this story to life. And some parts of the game were confusing or hard to follow, and players didn't always know where to go. The translation from Japanese to English wasn't always perfect either, and made the dialogue feel a little strange or unclear in some places. Still though, Strider for the NES left a strong impression on those who played it. It showed that even an 8-bit system like the NES at the time could be used to tell a big dramatic story. Now let's dive into the heart of the game, the gameplay itself. When you first boot up Strider on the NES, you might expect something fast-paced like the arcade version, or maybe the slick side-scrolling action of the Sega Genesis hit. But what you actually get is something very different, and not in a bad way. The NES version of Strider is its own beast, more of an action-adventure game than a straight-up platformer. In fact, it feels like a mix between sci-fi spy movie and old-school RPG. Instead of just blasting through level after level in a straight line, you're thrown into a large, open-ended area. And these places are packed with secret rooms, hidden doors, and characters you need to talk to in order to figure out your next move. It's less about pure action and more about exploring, learning, and figuring things out. And in this version, you play as Hiryu, a futuristic ninja armed with a high-tech sword called the Cypher, which is a fast slicing weapon you'll use a lot. That's its primary attack. But it's not the only tool in your arsenal. As you move through the world, you'll come across all kinds of key items, some health upgrades, and things that make you tougher. Now one thing I will say about the Strider game, it doesn't really hold your hand, and a lot of people have played this game and beat this game and never knew about pushing the select button. If you push the select button, it'll pop up with a lot of attacks. Because if you look, you have your HP and your EP, and people are like, what is the EP? I don't know what it does. They never just bothered to push select and see all the stuff you can do. So Strider was deeper than just that Cypher. He did have like magic, like healing powers, fire shots, and so forth, a super jump. But a lot of people played through the game because, like I say, it doesn't hold your hand, and they didn't even know they had those powers. Others are special boots that let you jump higher, helping you reach new places. And then there's the data discs, glowing pieces of information that reveal hidden secrets. It's part of the storyline and gives you clues on where to go next. Now, one of the biggest mechanics in the game is backtracking, and that means returning to places you've already been. But now you're doing it with new items and abilities that let you access areas that were blocked off before. And this kind of design keeps you thinking. It rewards players who pay attention, explore everything, and take notes. But here's the catch. The game does not hold your hand. There's no map, no in-game quest log, no arrows pointing to your next destination. And straight up, if you forget where a locked door was or don't remember what character told you, you could be stuck for hours. Players had to rely on memory, trial and error, and sometimes even drawing their own maps or writing notes in a notebook just to keep track of everything. Still though, for gamers who had the patience and determination to push through this game, Strider on the NES offered a different kind of adventure, one that blended action with exploration, mystery, and a whole lot of challenge. Now, if you ask me, I feel like Strider was kind of ahead of its time in some ways. I mean, there were a few games that did that on NES. You had Metroid, that's like the main one, and so forth, Metroidvania style games. But I don't feel like those games really took off and became the mainstream until, I'd say, Symphony of the Night was kind of like the official first coined Metroidvania. But the style of the gameplay did show up only in a handful of games, Metroid being one of them, Metroidvania, and this game kind of gave you a big world of exploration. And there were a handful of other games on the NES that did that as well. So kudos to Strider for trying something different. And now, friends, here comes the bad time. The glitches and the bugs. This is where Strider for the NES for a lot of people fall apart. Some could say it's charmed by today's standards because Strider does still have a big following. Me personally, I love the game. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But at the same time, it was still a very fun game when I played it. So, but we have to address the elephant in the room. So it pains me to do this, but let's talk about it. So at first glance, Strider for the NES looks like it's going to be something special. The artwork is cool, the music is very catchy, I mean, one of the best soundtracks ever, I think, and the story seems like it could be exciting. But once you actually start playing, things begin to fall apart just a little bit. Well, who are we kidding here? Fast. And that being said, even though the game had big ideas and tried to do something different than other action games on the NES, it was sadly held back by a long list of problems. And these weren't issues you could just ignore. They were the kind of problems that made the game frustrating and at times nearly impossible in some people's minds. So let's take a look. First up, we got the glitches and bugs. The game is definitely full of all kind of glitches. There are little programming mistakes that cause the game to behave in ways it's probably not supposed to. For example, some doors just won't open at times, even if you picked up the item that's supposed to unlock them. And this can leave players stuck with no idea what they did wrong. Imagine playing for over an hour, collecting everything you think you need, and then finding a locked door that just refuses to open. It's enough to make anybody just shut the game off. Then there's the translation issues. Now, we wouldn't know this in the States, but Strider was originally made in Japan, and when it was brought over to North America, the English translations were poorly done. Now, I think what really made this game confusing was the fact that Strider for the NES is in continuation with the comic book. Now, I never read the Strider comic book before. I mean, I kind of glanced at it here and there in modern times. When I say modern, I'd say pre-2010, but as far as actually 1990, there's no way. You know, internet's not what it was. There was no internet back then. There's pre-internet, so you really couldn't look at the magazines or get the lore unless you lived in Japan. So with that, it made the whole story confusing. Now, the arcade was a little different because it was kind of, here we are, and here's the ending. With the NES version, there was a story to tell, and without reading the comic book, the story's fragmented and it doesn't really make sense, which I always thought it did. I was kind of like, well, why is this guy going rogue? Why is Kane acting crazy? What's Zane? Just all kind of stuff, and it's not clear unless you read the manga. So let's go ahead and clear that up so it makes a little more sense. One of the major issues with Strider on the NES is how it feels to play. The controls are stiff and very awkward at times, and it makes it sometimes extremely tough to move around and fight enemies smoothly. And then Hiryu jumps in a way that feels floaty. I mean, it's floaty, but then it's not floaty. I mean, it's like he's bouncing on the moon, and you never quite feel in control pretty much where he's gonna land. And that's a big problem in a game that has a lot of tricky jumps. Now, his main weapon is a Cypher and it's supposed to be a high-tech blade, but in the NES version, it's kind of short and stubby. And some enemies take multiple hits and will randomly attack in weird patterns, making the fights feel unfair and unbalanced at times. I mean, sometimes you'll hit the enemy, but you guys will exchange and hit each other. I'm like, come on, this guy is facing the other way, but I'm still getting hit, And probably the worst for me is probably the triangle jump. Now, there are certain parts in the game where you have to do this, and what you're supposed to do, because it's smooth in every other game, or a lot of other games, is you got to jump on a wall, push the other direction, land on this wall, and so forth. Triangle jump, like in tons of games. For Strider, for some reason, it's super hard to do. You have to basically mash like a madman to catch the wall, and then push back in the other direction. And sometimes you'll drop down. I mean, here, I'll give you an example right here. You can look at the example I'll show you after this triangle jump. But it's just so hard and frustrating. Once you get it down, you're still gonna mess it up because there's no way to really get this thing down. It's with a turbo controller. If you're playing with I don't know why you play Strider with a turbo controller anyway. But let's say the jumping is easy. But if you're trying to manually time it, forget about it. You have to mash to get that triangle jump. And let's talk about the confusing world design. At times, Strider tries to be more than just a side-scrolling action game. It wants to be an adventure, of course, and that means you're expected to explore, collect items, talk to characters, and find your way through a big world. But the game doesn't do a really good job of helping you along the way. There's no map, no helpful arrows, and no real sense of direction. Now, that's not to say that's not uncommon in the NES game. I mean, that wouldn't be a fair statement. Lots of games didn't hold your hand back in the NES era. So Strider, I would think a map might help. I would think maybe just them giving you a little more clues, pushing you a little bit more where to go. But this game, unless you call the Nintendo Power Hotline, a 1-900 number and spent like, was it $1 a minute or whatever it was, then you just gotta wait for another magazine to come out with the answer for you. Because like I said, again, pre-internet. So this game could get confusing at times. So basically you're dropped in a world and told to figure it out on your own. Items you find might be important, or they might not do nothing at all. And if you miss a key item, the game won't tell you. You'll just wander around confused, trying to figure out what went wrong. So with all that said, let's talk about the story beneath all these glitches. At first glance, Strider might look like just another game. But underneath its awkward jumps, strange dialogue, and confusing level layout, there's actually a pretty good, deep, and surprising story. The problem though, almost nobody knew what it was. The storytelling of Strider is hidden behind rough English translations, strange pacing, and a lack of clear direction. But for those who took the time to dig into the text, and if you lived in Japan and could read the other ends of the comic books, there's a powerful and emotional story waiting to be uncovered. So you play as Hiryu, a young elite ninja known as a Strider, and the game begins with a mission to rescue his old friend Kane, who has mysteriously gone missing. Now Hiryu soon learns that Kane hasn't just been captured, he's actually been brainwashed. As Hiryu searches for answers, things get darker along the way. He discovers that the organization he works for, the Striders themselves, have been compromised from the inside, and some of the very people he trusted have become enemies. Also along the way, he's forced to fight assassins from his past, giant machines, and even other Striders who have turned rogue, who have turned against him. So at this point, Hiryu isn't just fighting to stop a villain, he's trying to figure out the truth. He's trying to figure out why the Striders turned evil, why his best friend Kane turned evil, and what's going on with the brainwashing. So eventually Hiryu learns that the mind control device controlling everyone is hidden in a strange futuristic version of Los Angeles. And this leads to the dramatic final scene where Hiryu must break through the enemy forces, destroy the machine, and take on the final boss in a climatic battle that tests all his skills and beliefs. Now if the game story had been told a little better, or if we knew about the comic book, the game would have made more sense, but we're just taking a fragmented story, and that's why a lot of people thought the story was kind of weird, and it made it kind of dark, which is actually a good thing. It did give it a kind of a dark feel. Now let's talk about the battle of the Striders. NES versus arcade versus Genesis. Now when people talk about Strider, they're usually thinking of fast sword slashing action, big explosions, and wild science fiction settings. But what many fans don't realize is there are actually 3 major versions of Strider from the early days, and each one is very different. So let's take a closer look at how these 3 versions compare. You got the Flash Arcade Original, the legendary Genesis port, and the bold but buggy NES version. Let's start with the arcade in 1989, the one that started it all. The original arcade game hit the scene in 1989, and it turned heads immediately. It was loud, colorful, and packed with action. Players stepped into the boots of Hiryu, a futuristic ninja who ran, flipped, and slashed his way through enemies in a high-tech dystopian world. And this game was designed to eat quarters. I mean, just like most arcade games at the time, it was tough and very intense. Every level of the game threw something new at you: giant robotic gorillas, flying airships, gravity-defying jumps, and laser-splitting dragons. The action was non-stop, and the animations were smooth as butter, and the sound effects in this game were epic. Now, it wasn't a long game, but honestly, it didn't need to be. It ate enough quarters to make your session worthwhile. And the goal was to grab players' attention fast and keep them coming back for more. Just one more try, one more quarter, and to no surprise, it worked. Strider became one of Capcom's biggest arcade hits and left a lasting impact in history. Next up, we got Strider Sega Genesis 1990. 1 year later, Strider landed on the Sega Genesis, and this version is often called one of the best arcade-to-home conversions ever made at the time. And honestly, it's easy to see why. The Genesis port captured nearly all the arcade speed, style, and energy. The graphics were slightly toned down, but the spirit of the game was fully alive. Hiryu still moved like a superhero with fluid animations and lightning-fast sword swings, and the bosses were still huge and creative, and the stages were just as wild as they were in the arcade. And what made this version stand out wasn't just how faithful it was to the arcade, how smooth it actually played. The Genesis controller made the game feel responsive and tight, and players didn't just have to survive the action, they felt in control. And this version quickly became a fan favorite and a must-have for Sega fans. Many gamers still see it as one of the best action games on the Genesis. And then there was the NES version, the most unusual of the 3. Now this released in the same year as the Genesis port, the NES Strider wasn't a direct copy of the arcade game. And just to be fair, Nintendo was often known for having arcade ports translated to the NES and be something completely different. Hints of the game, certain similarities, but a whole different experience. For example, the one that sticks to my mind the most, and probably one of the most disappointing, was Double Dragon. Double Dragon in the arcade needs no introduction. You played Double Dragon before. But Double Dragon at home, they introduced a whole different things. They took away the whole format how the game played. I mean, in the NES version, you had like power-ups you had to get. All your moves didn't come unlocked right away. Now, so that was considered a negative in some ways, but in some ways it was a positive because it gave you a leveling system and it did introduce new moves and new stages. So, you know, while they share the same name, totally 2 different games. And that could be a good thing, you know, because let's be real, I don't think the NES could handle that, you know? So I think Strider kind of followed suit. Now the NES version focused more on exploration and story than fast-paced action. There were text conversations, inventory items, and the different regions to travel between. And it felt more like a platforming adventure game than an arcade-style action title. And while these ideas were bold and it made sense at the time, the execution is where it had its problems. The game was slower, the controls were clunky at times, and the difficulty could be unfair, depending on who you are. And some players got frustrated with the bugs that could stop progress or glitchy errors that made the game hard to finish without a guide. Still though, for fans who were looking for depth, mystery, and a bigger story, the NES Strider had something special. Now it wasn't perfect, but it dared to be different. So each version of Strider had its own identity. The arcade version is all about fast action, visual excitement, and it's perfect for thrill seekers and people with deep pockets. Now the Genesis version is a near perfect home experience, smooth, stylish, and just a lot of fun. And the NES version is more of a thinking's man game. Deeper, slower, and filled with hidden layers. And most fans agree that the arcade and Genesis versions deliver the best action. But if you're someone who likes to dig into a game's world, uncover secrets, and experience something a little bit different, the NES version still deserves your attention and just might be the one for you, glitches and all. So last part, let's talk about the legacy Strider left behind. Sometimes the game disappears from the spotlight, not because it was a terrible game, but because it was just different. Too different for its time. And that's exactly what happened to Strider for the NES. Unlike the popular arcade and Sega Genesis cousins, this version didn't get much love in the beginning. In fact, Capcom never brought it back. No digital releases on the Wii, no special appearance in Capcom game collections, not even to mention in companies' retrospectives. It became the forgotten Strider, quietly pushed into the background. But this isn't the end of the story. Now this game, bad as it was at the time, actually, I won't say aged like fine wine, but a lot of old retro heads and retro game collectors seek this game out and still actively play it. And with its deep exploration, it's an awesome game for speedruns. Not to mention, let's talk about the good parts. I mean, for me personally, I like this game. I remember I got this game in 1989, freshman year of high school, and I was blown away by it. But at the same time, to be fair, I really didn't have nothing to compare it to because the first time for me playing Strider was actually on NES, and then when I saw the arcade, yeah, okay, bigger and badder and everything, but I actually enjoyed what part of the story I can get from the NES version of Strider. And even though the game didn't sell very well or get great reviews at the time, its ideas didn't vanish completely. In 2014, when Capcom decided to reboot Strider for modern consoles, they gave the series a sleek new look and brought Hideo back to the spotlight. They didn't just use the exact story from the NES game, they skipped over it completely, focusing more on the arcade-style action. But if you look closely, you can still see little traces of the NES version's DNA, along with the global missions, the idea of lone agents working behind enemy lines, the theme of the mind control, and betrayal. These story elements actually survived, even if the original game didn't. So what are my final thoughts of Strider for the NES? Personally, I felt like the game at the time was, I thought it was awesome. Okay, I felt like the game, and don't get me wrong, was it perfect? No. Was it game of the year? No. But the music was such a, it's just great music. It fit all the things. If you never played the game before, the music in it is just awesome. Capcom made some great tracks for this game. Also, if it's your first time like me playing Strider on NES, you had nothing to compare it to, okay? The story was a little convoluted because I never read the manga, but so I didn't really understand where it was coming from. So I kind of just got thrown into the middle of a story and just kind of picked up the pieces. But for the most part, I feel like it was a pretty good game. And it didn't hold your hand. I mean, you had to actually dig in and play the game and figure things out. So overall, I feel like Strider for the NES, for me personally, I feel like it's a good game. But that's just me though. A lot of people crapped all over this game, and when you do compare it to the arcade, there are major differences. So honestly, I'd say if you're a gamer that likes to just short bursts of fun and big lights and everything, play the Genesis or the arcade version. But if you're more into, you know, RPG-like elements, the challenge of a game, then definitely play the NES version. Now this game can be challenging, and if you're interested in a walkthrough of this game, then your boy just so happened to make one. So you can check that video out up here where I go through step by step and show you how to play this game and overcome it. So that's gonna do it for this one, guys. But as always, take care of yourself, protect your inner peace, God bless you, and we'll catch you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.